Opening the Routes, broadcast in 1979. I remember making this programme with particular pleasure for all kinds of reasons, but mainly because it gave me 40 years ago the chance to interview some of the surviving pioneers of passengers and airline staff who started the whole thing nearly 100 years ago. The first scheduled international flights were between London and Paris, and the aircraft were converted World War I bombers. At the time, flying at all was considered foolhardy, wet, cold and dangerous. It was all of those things. In this programme, you'll be hearing, among others, from Wing Commander Mackintosh, a World War I veteran, who, on one flight to Paris, had to make 11 forced landings. And you'll be hearing from some of the very first air hostesses, all nurses, trained to calm passengers' nerves, and from many others. I know you'll enjoy meeting them.
Passengers should get out through passport control on the first floor to the final departure lounge.
Will passengers Bailey, Gill and Alfred please go immediately to gate 53 where the flight is now closing.
Hounslow Heath on the outskirts of London, and there's nothing on this sad stretch of wasteland to suggest that this was not only the site for Britain's first international airport, but arguably where the whole thing began. In our first two programmes, we looked at air travel as it is today, and took note of some of the questions that are being asked on its 60th birthday. Well, now we're going back to where it all started. 60 years ago, I imagine the only question anyone was asking is, will I get there, or will the infernal machine fall out of the sky? Most people then were sensibly still travelling by train or by boat, on horses or on donkeys. And yet, on the 25th of August, 60 years ago, the first international daily scheduled air service started here on Hounslow Heath, where the highwayman Dick Turpin used to ride.
The First World War had just ended, and a newly formed airline, Aircraft Transport and Travel, had come into being. On that first scheduled flight across the English Channel to Paris, the plane carried 4 passengers, a bundle of newspapers, some jars of Devonshire cream, and several brace of grouse. The trip took 2 hours and 25 minutes. The age of fare-paying air passengers had begun. In those carefree post-war years, flying was for fun again. On the English side of the Channel, in 1919, the only airfield with customs and immigration facilities was at Hounslow. And so this drab collection of sheds became London's first international airport, where you couldn't even buy a cup of tea. Although the Wright brothers had flown 16 years earlier, it was the war that really developed flying machines. And ever since, advances in military aircraft have often been turned to the advantage of the fare-paying passenger. The first airlines used converted wartime bombers. They were well-to-do men and women, those early passengers, the sort who weekended in Paris. Very few children at first. Some Americans touring the battlefields, and businessmen hoping to beat the competition. But to fly at all was considered a bit foolhardy. Before takeoff, the names of next of kin were noted, just in case. And quite apart from the risk, they received very little in the way of comfort for their 20-guinea fare. The wicker seats were hard, there was no heating, and if it rained, the outside passengers in what had been the front gunner's cockpit got wet, and they always got cold. So flying suits and goggles were issued free. Caroline Rogers was then one of the growing number of affluent American visitors to Europe, young and adventurous.
I just wanted to fly, that was all. I just had to fly.
But to fly was still considered such a daring thing, she only wrote home about it afterwards.
Dear Mother and Father, this morning at 10:30 I was in Paris, and this afternoon at 3 in London. A plane was already on the field, all tuned up. We snapped a few pictures and then climbed inside, right in the nose of the plane, and the pilot was just behind us. We moved slowly under our own power, and then they speeded up and without any bumping left the ground. It felt more like an automobile. The vibration of the plane and the noise was so great that we had a feeling of firmness. There was nothing to eat on the plane, of course. I think it would have flown right out of our hands. And we loved to stick our head out a little bit like this and see if, and it would blow right back like that. It took us an hour and 50 minutes to reach the channel and 3/4 to cross it. We passed over a freighter and a beautiful square rigger. It began to get a little bumpy, and when we reached the English coast, it was very bumpy.
Bumpiness was the least of the difficulties facing the pilot, who found his route by following the roads and railway lines. Wing Commander R.H. McIntosh.
We had a primitive aircraft. We had no blind flying instruments whatsoever. Our compasses were faulty. Our altimeters were also faulty. We had no radio. Our engines were very unreliable, plus the question that we had radiators holding 14 gallons of water in each engine. Well, these used to develop cylinder leaks, and of course then the engine would overheat. Only one thing that happened was a question of forced landings. I had 11 on one occasion. It took me 2 days to get to Paris. I was far from being the record. The record was 17. I can't remember who the pilot was.
For his weather reports before each scheduled departure, Wing Commander McIntosh simply rang a local contact on the coast.
Tilbury Police, before I say, yes, sir. Oh, good morning. This is Handy Page Transport, Cricklewood Aerodrome. Could you give me a weather report? Yes, hold on a second, sir. I'll look out the window. In due course, back come the answer. Cloud about 400 feet, no rain, bit chilly like. You say, what's the forward views? I beg your pardon? How far can you see? You distinctly hear him call his friend on the gate. Harry, can you see the Fox and Dogs at the local pub? If they answered in the affirmative, back came the answer, 2.5 miles. That was our weather reporting. So off we went with a prayer.
And the prayer had to see him through customs too, because the pilot was personally responsible for his passengers until they and their baggage were cleared. Steady profits have always evaded the airlines, and from the start, the French, Dutch, German and Belgian governments all subsidized their civil aviation. At first, the British Airlines, now moved from Hounslow to Croydon Aerodrome in South London, had to go it alone, and they found chasing a limited number of passengers hard going. Only in 1924, after one firm had been forced out of business, was the British government prepared to support the merger that produced a single airline, Imperial Airways, the forerunner of BOAC, today's British Airways. Elsewhere in Europe, new airlines blossomed and faded. Those that survived are the ancestors of the airlines we know today. By now, the major cities of Europe and North Africa were linked by air, and so well patronized were the flights that you might have found yourself strap hanging, 15 of you in a 10-seater plane.
And this is the sort of aircraft you'd have travelled in, a Farman Goliath, operated by Farman Airlines, one of the ancestor companies of Air France. This, in fact, was the first French airliner, and like so many other civil aircraft of the time, it was adapted from a World War I bomber. It's hard to imagine, but in this fragile construction of wooden canvas, you could actually go from London to Paris, city centre to city centre, in only about 40 minutes longer than it takes today. Well, this old bird has actually lost her wings. She's in the Musée de l'Air in Paris, but inside she's pretty complete. She bears an uncanny resemblance to a tram.
As you can see, the passengers were seated in wicker chairs. Everything else would have been much too heavy. The pilot was up top,
With his head still in the open air, surrounded by his ramshackle collection of knobs and levers and wires.
There were 8 passengers sitting here in the rear cabin and 4 up front. There were cushions in the chairs, there were curtains in the windows which could be opened to improve ventilation. There was even a cabin boy to bring round hot coffee and sandwiches.
The fare London to Paris was 6 guineas, about 50% more than it cost to go by sea and rail. Then as now, there was very little competition between the airlines as far as price was concerned. The International Air Traffic Association, IATA, was already influential in that direction. But there was a great deal of rivalry and competition in other respects. To the British, with their passion for plumbing, must go credit for introducing the in-flight lavatory, though KLM wasn't very far behind. And to the French must go credit for improving the quality of in-flight meals. How about this for a cross-channel menu? In the mid-1920s, they were offering hors d'oeuvres, lobster, chicken, York ham, salad, ice cream, cheese, fruit salad, with a choice of several wines, whiskey and coffee.
The London-Paris route taught the operators a number of valuable lessons, not least that there was a market for a regular and dependable service among people for whom time was all important, and that those same people were prepared to pay over the odds to avoid long journeys by sea and by train and all the changes and delays and frustrations that were involved. They also learned that the secret of success in running an airline is efficient aircraft, and then as now that means larger aircraft. They were looking for a machine to carry at least 12 passengers in order to keep fares down to an acceptable level. And finally, there was the all-important matter of air mail. All over the world, the airlines needed government contracts to carry air mail in order to subsidize the transportation of passengers. Nowhere was that more true than in the United States. Indeed, in the US, it was the post office that ran the first regular airline services.
Today, airlines in North America carry about half the world's air passengers, not counting China and the Soviet Union. But in the 1920s, they lagged well behind Europe. Then, in 1926, the government turned over the post office air routes to private operators. And on the morning of the 6th of April, 1926, America's first scheduled passenger service began. Amid scenes of great enthusiasm, Varney Airlines flew from Pasco, Washington to Elko, Nevada, and its pilot, Leon D. Cuddeback took off into history. Thereafter, progress was rapid. There was public pressure and ballyhoo to get airports established and to encourage intercity flying to an extent that didn't occur in any other country. Just as communities had competed for the railways 100 years earlier, now they strove to attract the airlines. Across the vast internal distances of the American continent, the commercial advantages of air travel were obvious. But a coast-to-coast link across the United States wasn't established for 3 years, and then only with the help of the railways. In 1929, Transcontinental Air Transport, TAT, took 10 hardy passengers from New York to Los Angeles. At night, they traveled by train, for night flying was still not possible, and by day they flew. Apart from speed, what did they get for a single fare of $351?
At each of these air terminals, we find unexpected comforts and conveniences, beautifully appointed restrooms, and courteous attendants who look after our traveling needs. Here at Port Columbus, our baggage is weighed. 30 pounds is the allowance. It is 8:15 in the morning now, time to take off. The big tri-motor all-metal plane is ready and waiting, equipped like a Pullman car. Its roomy cabin is well lighted and heated in wintertime. Seated in our comfortable chairs, we are all set now to see America best.
The promoters didn't mention that passengers would need to stuff cotton wool in their ears against the roar of the engines, or that vibration would shimmy them in their seats, even shake the glasses off their noses. And yet a courier served cold chicken sandwiches and hot soup, and if they wanted fresh air aboard the 110-mile-an-hour Tin Goose, they could open the windows. On bad weather landings, mud was sucked in through the air vents and splattered onto them. At the end of the day's flight, the transfer from plane direct to train and back again to aeroplane the following morning was done in special aero cars. The whole journey, by plane and train, across the United States, took just over 48 hours.
Plane from New York and the east, arriving 4:20 on time.
A year later, in 1930, the coast-to-coast service was all by air, with just an overnight rest in Kansas City. And soon after that, TWA, as the airline now became, had mastered night flying and reduced the journey time to 24 hours. It was the United States that produced the world's first air hostesses. In 1930, Ellen Church, a tiny nurse from San Francisco, urged Boeing Air Transport, later to be part of United Airlines, to give her a job on their planes. Boeing's district manager agreed and hired 7 more nurses. "Imagine the psychology," he said, "of having young women as regular members of the crew. I'm not suggesting at all the flapper type of girl, of course." Because of weight restrictions, none was over 5'4" or weighed over 115 pounds, and they learnt as they flew. Before takeoff, they helped load the luggage, wound the clocks, made sure the seats were bolted down tightly, and during the flight, checked that smokers didn't throw their cigar butts out of the window.
We had china, silver. We had tables that we put up.
One of those original 8 stewardesses, Cornelia Tyson.
From Chicago, our food was prepared by the Palmer House, and it was good. We had chicken and rolls, and the one thing that everybody liked was the fruit cocktails, which were laced with brandy, and they were really pretty good. And this was during Prohibition, you know. It was an old nurse's trick to put a pillow under a tray, you know, and we had the little pillows which would keep things from jiggling.
Were passengers then nervous? I mean, flying was something that was so new. Did you have to deal with a lot of nervous passengers?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And that was primarily one of the reasons that they had nurses, because they felt we knew how to handle patients and to calm them. And this was one of the things that we were supposed to do to passengers on the aircraft, which we did. And it was rough. And in the wintertime, we froze. It was cold, you know. We had heaters, but they were not very efficient.
Presumably you had a lavatory on board or something?
Oh, yes, yes. We had a lavatory, which was adjacent to the outside door. And this was one of the things we warned the passengers about, going to the lavatory rather than walking out of the plane. But, however, it was latched, and we sort of kept an eye on it.
You mean nobody actually did?
No, no one actually did. And I don't think anyone really thought it would last. But it was worth a try, and we were really interested in seeing what was going to happen. However, I don't think any of us, in our wildest dreams, ever thought that it would develop into the profession that it has.
Now the task of the airlines was to woo the well-to-do boat and train travellers from their well-established comfort. To persuade potential passengers that it was no longer dangerous to fly, Imperial Airways organised tea-time flights over London.
Now, folks, anybody else like a flight before I put the plane back in the washhouse? Round the gasworks 1 and 6, looping the loop 3 extra, and no charge for falling out. Higher and higher and higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, up in my plane I soar, 20 feet or more. I'm a flyer, a flyer, a flyer, no, not a liar, a flyer. They take my flying bedstead for a lark. And when I fly in the sky, they all cry as I pass by, Airman, airman, don't put the wind up me. And when I fly round the town, knocking people's aerials down, Airman, airman, don't put the wind up me. They all look up and say, is it a fairy, a cock-a-doodle-doodle-doodle-doo, or a canary? And when I fly, they all shout, someone's let the linnet out. Oh, airman, airman, don't put the wind up me.
Good publicity, but who were the passengers they hoped to attract? In 1928, the old wooden huts and muddy surroundings of London's Croydon Airport were replaced by a paved apron and a modern tailor-made terminal for travellers who expected and were given every attention. Imperial Airways staff at Croydon were trained to serve a demanding public. Eric Wheatley.
Well, the passengers came from the well-to-do sector of the community. There were a lot of others who could afford to fly, but were scared. So our main job really was to encourage them. Now, our passengers, most of which had arrived by Rolls-Royce, hadn't very much time to wait. And we treated them like a person, not like a bunch of cattle as they are today. In fact, they were personally escorted to the aircraft, which was just a few yards from the airport building. We, the staff, were forbidden to run in front of the passengers or the aircraft. If we were caught, then we were put on the mat, because it could cause a sense of urgency. All times, we had to keep our passengers at ease. One of the biggest hazards was, of course, in those days, the press wanted to get hold of the people who were flying, because it was quite an adventure. And we used to cooperate by giving them the passenger list. Well, on one occasion, they printed that Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so went to Paris last weekend, and the wife read it in the paper, and she wanted to know who the hell went, you know. So we had to be very careful, and we didn't do it anymore. Weight was very critical in those days, and everything had to be weighed, the freight, the mail, the passengers, their baggage. But of course, the funny thing was when we were weighing the ladies in the hall, of course, the ladies didn't want everybody to know how much they weighed. So the real gentleman didn't look at the scale. The only person who did was the officer who was doing the weighing, because this all added up to how much weight the aircraft could carry. And if the passenger and the baggage was too heavy, then the bag used to wait until the next aircraft.
In Germany, Lufthansa also made outstanding contributions to passenger comfort. In the Junkers G38, they put 34 passengers on 2 levels, with a lounge in the wings themselves, giving travellers the same view as the pilot. This was the biggest land plane of its time and offered high luxury. Smoking was allowed, and a 5-course hot meal with wine was served in flight. On the ground, there was also rapid progress. The new Tempelhof Airport in Berlin stood at the center of a snowflake pattern of runways to minimize taxiing. For passengers then, there was none of the tedious delay at the terminal we endure today. They were ferried direct to downtown Berlin in shuttle buses, leaving their aircraft to be worked over by a regiment of cleaners armed with a rug beater. Incoming passengers found a modern terminal where they could wait in comfort at the check-in. But despite advances in Europe, it was America that was to dominate the development of commercial flying.
A cigarette that bears a lipstick's traces, an airline ticket to romantic places, and still my heart has wings. These foolish things remind me of you.
Perhaps the most powerful tribute to the progress made by civil aviation in the 1930s was the official acknowledgement by the American film industry that flying could now be considered safe for their Hollywood stars. It was no longer an eccentric or foolish way to travel, but becoming quite routine for the wealthy minority who could buy the speed, reliability, safety, and comfort that the aircraft could increasingly provide. The sort of service that's taken for granted by the much wider public carried by the great jets over much longer distances today. But 50 years ago, when long-haul flying was in its infancy, what was it that persuaded the public to fly? It was empire that provided the impetus. The great traders and transporters, the Dutch and the French and the British, trailblazed the intercontinental routes. And this, incredibly, is the sort of machine they did it with. Only 10 years after that first tentative scheduled flight between London and Paris, without reliable maps, radio stations, or weather reports, they were pushing air transport to its limits. In 1929, the first international long-haul air service opened between Amsterdam and the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, a distance of 9,000 miles. For 11 years, till World War II, this remained the longest scheduled air route anywhere. This fortnightly mail run, operated by KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, took years of planning and exploratory flights to prove possible. But finally, the enthusiastic and air-minded Dutch people were able to celebrate the inaugural flight. By 1938, aircraft were beginning to look like modern machines. The new American airliner, the all-metal DC-3, cut the journey time from London to India to 3 days, as opposed to 3 weeks by boat. Cabin staff on those early long-distance flights were always men, and among the passengers they now served were children shuttling between boarding school in Europe and their parents in the empires. 10-year-olds like Constance Halford Thompson, who remembers that cabins were still unpressurized.
And then we were flying mostly at 10,000 feet. And once we were going higher, and the steward came round and said if we had a headache or felt ill, he'd bring the oxygen. So I thought, well, I must try this. Immediately said I had a headache, and he brought a little thing which he put over my nose and said, breathe in, which made me feel terrible. So I felt I'd already recovered. The book which I was given by KLM, showing the entire route. It gave every place we went over, every river, every building, so you could look out of the window and then look in the book and see what it was. So it helped to pass the time.
Just as KLM served the Dutch Empire, the British flew to South Africa, India and Australia. But not always with full government support, as the late aviator Sir Alan Cobham recalled.
I remember on one occasion addressing a special luncheon party at the Carlton, where I think it was the cabinet of the day, and Lord Birkenhead replied, you see, after I'd given my impassioned speech on flying to India. And he said, Cobham has told us all about flying to India and back in a week. At the present moment, when I send a dispatch to India, I say, thank God I can't get a reply under 2 months. Now Cobham is going to have a reply in a week. Life will be unbearable. We don't want airlines.
The Short Brothers C-Class Empire flying boat. Once again, it was the transportation of mail that subsidized a new passenger service and inspired a famous aircraft. Under the Empire Airmail scheme, Imperial Airways undertook to carry any piece of mail under ½ an ounce in weight between any 2 points in the Empire for 1.5 old pence. And the new flying boats carried 24 passengers, as well as the mail and baggage.
From 1936, they were flying from here in Southampton docks to points all over the Empire. These are the stairs where the flying boat passengers embarked and disembarked, and that's the old terminal, which is still called Imperial House. I wonder if any of the captains of the great ocean-going liners that were docking here in the 1930s ever imagined how quickly they would be commercially wiped out by those toy-like objects that were taking off and landing around them. A glance at the Southampton Dock Shipping Guide for 1937 is extremely revealing. First of all, it shows that more than 500,000 passengers embarked and disembarked here from ships. It shows that there were 40 sailings to New York alone, 40 sailings a month. Today, there isn't one that operates all the year round. It wasn't just that the aeroplane could carry passengers so much more quickly, but with the coming of the flying boat, it could now carry them in considerable comfort.
For those going home on leave from the outposts of Empire, the flying boats offered a speedy alternative to the long sea voyage, plus some of its familiar aspects, including the nautical jargon. Up forward, there was a smoking cabin for 7 passengers. Up aloft, in his own little office, a ship's purser ironed out any passenger difficulties. Below him, the galley and ladies' and gentlemen's lavatories. Amidships, a cabin for 3 passengers by day and 4 at night. The main cabin had a promenade deck from which to look out at the sights below. The specially designed reclining seats had hot and cold air vents and a bell push for the steward. It was a kind of club. But however much service was appreciated, there was no tipping, one of the big differences then and now between travel by air and by boat or rail. Until as recently as the 1950s, air travel was still one class, in effect first class. Both as passengers and as a station manager on the route to South Africa, Jean and Ian Scott Hill recall flying boat travel with great affection.
Well, the service offered to the passengers was undoubtedly motivated by the dedication of everybody to the mail must go through theme, which of course was very financially pertinent because indeed we got no subsidy if we were more than 48 hours late. The ticket covered absolutely everything. Once you had bought a ticket, you never had to put your hand in your pocket again. This again was a deliberate competitive marketing strategy versus the shipping lines.
Takeoffs, now they were really very special because taking off on water is quite different from anything else. The sensation of getting up speed and the beautiful smoothness of it all was really most unusual and most lovely feeling. There was a beautiful sort of droning background noise, not at all obtrusive, really. One could talk quite easily. And one had a complete sense of relaxation because it had a very high ceiling, the flying boat. And it gave one a feeling of spaciousness and ease, which immediately everyone seemed to relax. And then on the journey itself, one didn't travel, of course, the tremendous heights one does now. The captain would come back and say, we're just about to go over a large herd. We'll take you down low and circle over it once or twice. And indeed did so. So that was very exciting. And one saw these animals scampering away, you know, quite frightening for things.
Africa was, of course, a mecca for the safari business. There was a big business of very rich people down to Africa, Kenya and Uganda notably. That was perhaps 2% only of the passengers. The balance was made up almost exclusively of colonial civil servants going to and from leave, regiments and squadrons and so on based overseas.
The landing, which was absolutely marvelous, especially if it was on the Nile, for instance, where it wasn't very wide. And one was conscious of them coming down onto the water and the spray coming right up and almost obliterating the windows.
And the passengers were looked after with equal devotion at the night stops, such as Alexandria in Egypt, where station manager Patrick Gillibrand knew all about local pleasures.
Imperial Airways wanted to make quite sure that the passengers didn't have to worry about changing money every time they stayed a night. After all, there were quite a lot of night stops between London and Singapore. And so they issued their own currency coupons. They were in little pieces of paper worth 2 and 6pence or 5 shillings in a little booklet, which you could buy before you left. And the idea was that you should take them along to your representative, Imperial Airways representative in the hotel, and get cash for them in local currency. In practice, they became currency themselves. And I know for a fact that in Macon, the madame of the local bordello came along to cash her currency coupons at the office. And so did her sisters in Alexandria. So perhaps all our passengers weren't exactly angels.
Aotearoa, long white cloud. And here she is, landing at Rose Bay Air Base, Sydney, at the conclusion of her 10 days air passage from England.
In 1938, the Empire flying boat service from England to Australia was shared by the Australian airline Qantas. And yet Qantas had not been founded to preserve links with the mother country. Internal needs were far more pressing. Australia is vast, as large as Europe, and yet before the Second World War its entire population was no larger than that of London. No other people were more isolated than those on the sheep and cattle stations scattered across the parched interior of Queensland. A series of railway branch lines probed from the coast into the outback. Yet to go from, say, Longreach to Winton, 100 miles away, meant a journey of 1,400 miles. Soon after the first airlines began in Europe, a small internal air service linked those railheads. and both Winton and Longreach became sure of a place in aviation history. Longreach became the headquarters of that small airline, the Queensland and Northern Territories Aerial Service, now known worldwide as Qantas. The head office was at the corner of Duck Street and Eagle Street, and together with that other invention, the two-way radio, the isolation of the outback was broken. Aeroplanes brought the flying doctor service, fresh fruit for the first time, and above all for the women who'd suffered most, shopping trips to town. The first regular service was on November the 2nd, 1922, between Charleville and Cloncurry, with an overnight stop at Longreach to avoid the worst of the midday heat. Here at Longreach, that same airfield is still in use. Even the same hangar where engineer Arthur Baird struggled to keep those incredibly temperamental flying machines in the air. This is where Qantas picked up their very first passenger. On the first stage of the journey from Charleville, they'd carried only mail. But here, passenger number 1 climbed on board. His name was Alexander Kennedy, a local grazier, an old man of 85 with a remarkable faith in the future of aviation. In the very early days of Qantas, he'd agreed to invest £250 in the venture, but only on condition that he could have the very first ticket on the very first scheduled flight. When Alexander Kennedy first went from Longreach to Cloncurry in the 1880s, it took him 8.5 months. That's when he was driving cattle. And even in 1922, the journey by road was 4.5 days. That's when the roads were actually open. But now, on this scheduled air service, you could do it in 5.5 hours. And the cost was £11. There's no doubt that for those people who sat here waiting to fly, for the drovers and shearers and cattlemen and mining engineers, particularly for the sick and the elderly, the coming of the aeroplane to the outback was a blessing.
A lot of the passengers were country people. They weren't city slickers, you know. They were used to a hardy life. Riding in an aeroplane would be a luxury compared with having to get around 100 miles on a horse.
Captain Lester Brain was a Qantas pilot, and in the 1920s and 30s, he had to know all about the particular needs of his outback passengers.
These drovers had no baggage, but they'd always take their saddle and their sheepdog or their cattle dog. And we'd accommodate that. He'd sit under the seat the drover occupied. If there wasn't enough room for the saddle to fit in anywhere inside the aeroplane, well, we just tied it on the wing or on the undercarriage outside. But you weren't looking for lush meals and comfort when you flew, you know. You wanted to get somewhere. Most of them, when I first went out, they were having their first flight, and their friends would all come out to see them off and, you know, give them a hero's farewell, I mean, for venturing up into the air. But they knew we hadn't killed anybody. But the passengers were good, and they'd help on any job, whether it was passing up benzene tins or helping you change a tire. Someone had come out to the aerodrome with a set of broken false teeth and saying, well, look, you're going into so-and-so, would you get these fixed and bring them back when you come back on Tuesday? We brought them their air mail. We brought them little parcels, fashion goods or something that they wanted for a party out in the Longreach race meeting. It was the most popular job.
That most popular job has grown within one pilot's lifetime from this, linking the outback townships, to this, uniting Australia, a geographically isolated nation, with the rest of the world. This was the point of departure for what is, for me, perhaps the most romantic of all airline services ever, one that I'd dearly love to have flown. It's the old China Clipper flying boat base at Alameda, California, across the water from San Francisco. While the British and the Dutch were establishing their empire roots, the United States was busy in its spheres of influence in Central and South America, the Caribbean, and of course here in the Pacific. 50 years ago, it took 23 days to make the Pacific crossing by steamer. Then, yet another former World War I aviator appeared on the scene, this time a Navy flyer called Juan Trippe. He wasn't intimidated by the vastness of the oceans, even by the Pacific. He was determined to conquer them with the aeroplane, and he'd formed an airline to do just that and called it Pan American Airways. TRIP's first task was to develop an aircraft that could carry an economic payload over the long first stage from California to Hawaii, 2,400 miles. Fortunately, all the islands on the route belonged to the USA: Midway, Wake, Guam, and Manila in the Philippines. Early in 1935, a steamship crammed with experts and supplies set out to build 5 air bases from nothing. Wake Island was a deserted atoll that no one had set foot on in a decade. But the other islands also required a landing float, fuel tanks, a powerful radio station, meteorological equipment, all the back-breaking effort behind setting up a trans-ocean passenger service. Diesel generators, launches, water distillation plants, facilities for base crews, hotels for the passengers. By now, the aircraft, the Martin M130 flying boat, was ready, the largest air transport then built. It had the range of 2,400 miles and cruised at 130 miles an hour. Pan Am owned 3 of them. 15 passengers could eat hot meals in a well-appointed dining room and while away the 59 flying hours over the Pacific in fashionable staterooms. The first China Clipper passenger service began in October 1936, and over 1,000 requests were received for seats, even though the fare represented 2 years of average 1936 earnings. An American today could buy the same journey with 2 weeks' pay. What's more, when the service began, buying a ticket didn't even guarantee a journey. Captain Hack Gulbranson recalls that strong headwinds often meant a reduced payload.
In those days, priority didn't have the same meaning that it does today. Priority, in this case, really meant looking for the passenger who weighed the least. So there was a young lady there who won the toss. She was escorted down to the airplane, stepped aboard into the aircraft, and the door was slammed behind her by the steward. She was rather unnerved by that, looked around. She said, "Where are the other passengers?" He leered at her and said, "Well, you are the only one." We ran into very heavy winds, and along about 13 and a half hours after leaving Honolulu, the captain made a decision to return. By this time, the young lady had gone to bed, and the steward saw no reason to wake her up to tell her we're going back until we were just passing Diamond Head on the island of Oahu. Then he nudged her. She looked out, saw the waving palms, said, "This doesn't look like San Francisco." And he said, "Oh, no, we've had to go back." Well, she ran off that airplane like a scalded cat, and I think we never saw her again, so I think she went back by BOAT.
In 1937, Pan Am extended their route to Macau and Hong Kong, and by 1939, clippers carrying 74 passengers were traversing the Pacific. It was only 20 years since that first crossing of the English Channel from London to Paris in converted World War I bombers. The airlines had come a long way. Increasingly, American influence, stimulated by its own internal needs, was spreading around the world. One of the reasons why English is now the international air language, spoken even from the control tower of Moscow Airport. The dream of low-cost travel for everyone was still a dream, but it was closer to being realized. And the China Clipper operation gave Pan Am invaluable experience in the battle for the most prestigious passenger route of all, the North Atlantic, between the New World and the Old. And how that obstacle was conquered, and what it meant on both sides of the Atlantic, are the subjects of our next program.